Welcome to this epic explainer, where we're mapping out over 600 years of literally the most massive geographical and cultural transformations in world history. We're talking about an empire that bridged 3 continents, controlled the 7 seas, and absolutely changed the course of global events. I mean, from a small tribe fleeing the fearsome Mongols, they rose up to become a total world superpower, and then, eventually, the so-called sick man of Europe. This isn't just dusty history either. The borders and conflicts of today's Middle East and Europe, yeah, they were forged right here. Let's get into it.
So, here is our roadmap for today. 1. Birth of an empire. 2. Conquering the inconquerable city. 3. The magnificent peak. 4. The sick man of Europe. And finally, 5. The final collapse.
All right, starting right off with Section 1, Birth of an Empire, from nomads to regional power. Now, tracking their very first century, the territorial shifts are just wild. Around 1299, a leader named Osman I founded this tiny little Anatolian principality. From there, rapid expansion. By 1326, under his son Orhan, they capture Bursa. And by 1389, they are a dominant force, pushing way deep into the Balkans. But, it wasn't just a straight line up. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, they suffered a completely crushing defeat against the Turco-Mongol warlord Timur. It nearly wiped them off the map entirely. Yet, miraculously, they bounced back.
So, how did early leaders like Osman I pull off this massive expansion? Well, they leaned heavily into a really fierce warrior identity. His followers were known as Ghazis. These were highly dedicated Islamic warriors who operated under incredibly strict codes of conduct. And they used this intense ideological and military zeal to basically systematically conquer the fragmented, weakened Byzantine lands right around them.
And their early strategies? Honestly, pure tactical genius. They didn't just fight hard, they were incredibly adaptable. First, they united these fractured Turkic tribes in Anatolia. But the real game changer? They totally revolutionized their military structure. They were actually among the very first to swap out traditional horse archers for foot soldiers carrying muskets. Early adoption of gunpowder, right? This massive shift allowed them to just swallow up regional kingdoms that literally couldn't compete with their firepower.
Which brings us to Section 2, Conquering the Inconquerable City, the fall of Constantinople.
By the 15th century, the Ottomans had expanded wildly, but there was this massive Byzantine barrier stuck right in the middle of their territory, Constantinople, the city that had successfully thwarted Muslim armies for 800 years. Enter a 19-year-old sultan, Mehmet II, who famously declared, "Either I will conquer Istanbul or Istanbul will conquer me." He was determined to force the ultimate transformation for his empire, attempting a siege that pretty much everyone thought was mathematically and militarily impossible.
The sheer scale of innovation he brought to this siege is staggering. Mehmed didn't just show up with an army. He brought 26-foot cannons launching 1,200-pound boulders to absolutely batter those ancient walls. And when a massive iron chain blocked the harbor, no problem. He literally had his men drag 70 ships overland on grease logs in the dead of night just to bypass it. Absolutely wild. After a relentless 53-day siege, on May 29, 1453, the impregnable city finally fell. And here is exactly why this matters for us today. By taking Constantinople and renaming it Istanbul, the Ottomans suddenly controlled the vital land trade routes connecting Europe and Asia. This single, massive transformation forced European nations into a panic, desperately seeking new sea routes. This directly sparked the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama. Plus, these conquests officially transferred the title of Caliph to the Ottoman dynasty, cementing them as the spiritual leaders of the Muslim world.
Moving right along to Section 3, the magnificent peak, the golden age of Suleiman.
Now we are entering an era of absolute dominance. Under Suleiman, the map of the empire just explodes outward. Watch this rapid sequence of conquests. In 1521, they capture Belgrade. In 1522, they take Rhodes. By 1526, they conquer parts of Hungary, and by 1529, they march all the way up to the very gates of Vienna. And while all this land expansion was happening, their naval forces under admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa were completely dominating the Mediterranean Sea.
Administratively, it's just a marvel. They managed a breathtakingly diverse tri-continental domain. We're talking major parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. They controlled the holiest cities of Islam, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, while simultaneously ruling over millions of Christians and Jews across the Balkans, Greece, Egypt, and the Levant. Just a massive, complex puzzle of cultures.
But how on earth do you enforce rule over an area that massive? Well, the sources detail that the terrifying engine behind this military supremacy was the Janissaries. This was a highly disciplined, fiercely loyal elite standing army. They were formed through a system called devshirme, where young Christian boys were conscripted, converted to Islam, and given world-class military and administrative training. The brightest of the bunch could actually rise to the absolute highest levels of government.
But hey, the empire wasn't just a military machine. They were an incredibly sophisticated cultural powerhouse. Suleiman was actually known within his empire as the lawgiver because he instituted the Kanun, these standardized secular laws that protected citizens and simplified taxes across completely diverse populations. They also granted religious autonomy to their non-Muslim subjects, all while experiencing this massive cultural boom in grand mosque architecture, Iznik pottery, and astronomy. But what happens when an unstoppable empire just stops modernizing?
Well, that takes us to Section 4, the sick man of Europe, stagnation and decline.
Following their absolute peak, the mightiest superpower on Earth slowly began to fracture. You can clearly map this painful contraction. After a devastating defeat at the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, this once invincible military suffered cascading defeats against a rising Austria and Russia. By 1711, we see the Treaty of the Prusse. The Janissary Corps is finally abolished in 1826, and by the 1878 Congress of Berlin, European territories are being systematically stripped away.
What was happening here was a massive global paradigm shift. While Europe was wide awake, going through the scientific and industrial revolutions, the Ottomans largely stagnated. Plus, global trade was shifting from Mediterranean land routes to giant Atlantic Ocean vessels, which completely bypassed the Ottomans' overland Silk Road routes. Basically, they completely lost their technological and economic dominance.
And the decay was deeply internal, too. Sultans became completely detached from ruling, confined to their palace harems. Those once loyal Janissaries, they mutated into corrupt kingmakers, famously signaling their rebellions by marching out and literally overturning their giant soup cauldrons. You mix that with half-hearted modernization reforms and a growing wave of nationalism fracturing their Balkan provinces, and the empire was effectively paralyzed.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 5, the final collapse, World War I and dissolution.
The empire was teetering, but the ultimate end came from a brutal mix of internal revolution and global conflict. Desperate to save the crumbling state, a reformist group called the Young Turks launched a revolution in 1908, restoring the constitution. But, seeking to regain their lost glory, they made the fateful decision in 1914 to align with Germany and enter the disastrous meat grinder of World War I. This decision proved to be their absolute death warrant. Following the armistice of Mudros in 1918, the Republic of Turkey was eventually founded in 1923.
Now, as detailed objectively in the historical records, these final years were profoundly dark. Aligned with the Central Powers, the collapsing state was struck by massive internal dissent and the Arab Revolt. During this chaos, they enacted genocides against Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks, resulting in an immense and tragic loss of life. Finally, the victorious Allied powers, Britain and France, systematically partitioned what was left of the empire in the Middle East. 600! That is the incredible number of years this colossal superpower lasted before officially dissolving to birth the modern Republic of Turkey in 1923.
So, the big question we have to ask ourselves: do we have the courage to learn from the fall of history's greatest superpowers? Because the borders, the conflicts, and the rich cultures of today's world were completely forged in the fires of the Ottoman Empire. It's a stark reminder that no matter how magnificent, no matter how invincible an empire might seem, every single rise eventually meets its fall. When the world inevitably changes, do we adapt, or do we overturn our cauldrons and wait for the end? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.